Meantime, back in Confession Land, an email from James. I should warn you, for the sensitive listening, this confession does contain a reference to the BBC. Okay.
Oh dear.
In fact, it comes very early in this confession.
Right.
James says, in the early 1990s, I was a budding young journalist for a BBC local radio station somewhere up north. I was really chuffed to be working for such a fine institution so soon out of college. A place of world-beating journalism, a voice you can trust, and all that. I even had a photo ID pass with a graphic of the World Atlas on it to make me feel really puffed up. In the early days, I would accept any news shift on offer, and as I was new, that would mean all the rubbish ones, like the so-called graveyard shift, or very early morning reporter shift, or any weekend work. It was tough, stressful, but great fun. I was keen to impress my bosses and earn some much-needed money after university. One of the jobs I loved was the Saturday and Sunday shift, writing the news pages for CFAX. Now, they were long, 10-hour shifts, so the money was good. For those who don't know, CFAX was like a writing puzzle. The paragraphs had to be perfectly square, and that meant that words had to fit each line exactly, with no excess spaces. And they had to be accurate, obviously. There was a very strict CFAX rule book, and I stuck to it, and I would take great pride in my news pages. As there were no radio bulletins past 11 a.m, I was pretty much on my own all day, which I also loved, mainly because if I was particularly hungover, I used to take a nap in the soundproof news booth.
Those were the days.
Absolute bliss.
Yes.
My job was to write up any stories of the day. I would call the police, the fire or ambulance to see if anything had happened worthy of a page on CFAX. It was a lovely job. I'd sit there with my headphones on, listening to a rival radio station because it played better music, writing up perfectly square pages of copy in an empty newsroom with no bosses breathing down my neck. But it was when listening to the other local radio stations that I noticed something really annoying. Their news bulletin would be exactly the same as what I had written on CFAX. Every phrase, every word, every quote. I was furious. This was blatant plagiarism. And this was not just one local station. I listened across all 5 in our city.
Wow.
Different times.
Yeah.
And they too were using the exact words from my CFAX pages. These journalists were letting me do all the hard work.
Yeah.
I realised I was technically writing the news bulletins for 5 local stations. This would not have bothered me so much, but I'd previously applied to work at those radio stations, but told I wasn't good enough. But now it seemed my journalism was good enough. So understandably, this really annoyed me, so I decided sabotage was my only option, and I started a little game. Occasionally, when writing a story, I would plant a wild inaccuracy, knowing these lazy so-called journalists would not bother to double-check, but just copy it off the telly and read it out like it was their next bulletin. One story came in about a spate of house burglaries in the area. The suspect was described as around 5'7" tall, but I wrote on my CFAX page that the suspect was a massive 7'5" tall.
Wow.
And sure enough, my lazy counterparts copied it and read it out across all the local radio stations. No one had thought to question this. How it was that this giant and probably the world's tallest burglar was on their patch, or why the police hadn't been able to catch such a man-mountain. Or indeed, how does such a tall man get into people's houses in the first place?
Quite right.
Once I heard that they'd all copied my CFAX page, I corrected it, but the local radio stations carried on with their wrong information all day. A childish game, I know, but I just wanted revenge. And so it continued for a few weeks at least. There was the 19-stone dog.
Wow.
The 400-metre tall tree that had blown over to block a road. And the 11-year-old boy who achieved 5 grade A's at A-level. All these ridiculous facts reported by all the other radio stations without question. A 400-metre tree?
Really?
So, Simon and the team, I wish to seek forgiveness for spreading so many untruths. I wanted to teach the others a lesson. These deliberate inaccuracies didn't stay up for long, just enough time for all the other radio stations to copy it and make fools of themselves. And the other bit of good news was that I didn't last long in local news. It clearly wasn't for me. I went to work in TV instead. There's plenty more confessions there too, which we will await and we will enjoy as soon as they come in. But James, a splendid tale of local journalism going slightly wrong. Sister Jackie Brambles.
I think it's kind of reassuring to know that BBC management were well on top of every bulletin, and they did not seem to question these absurdities either. Good to know they were on the ball. The only reason I'm not forgiving is that you didn't go far enough. You could have taken that way, way, way further, which I would have greatly admired. So yeah, you should have whacked up the odds and the stakes a lot higher than that.
No forgiveness from Sister Jackie, brother from another gutter.
Yes, I mean, this absolutely rings bells, as any journalist knows, that it's always massively frustrating when you hear someone else parroting off the stuff that you've done yourself. So I am definitely going to forgive on this one, and I also concur with Jackie. Let's aim our fire at the BBC management. All their fault. Again, unlucky sunshine. I mean, James did end up working in telly, so, you know, it didn't turn out quite so well for him either. But everything's, worked out in the end, doesn't it? And for the BBC management.
We await further confessions from James, and we await the people's verdict. Do you forgive James, please, for his indiscretions about the 7.5-foot burglar, the 400-metre tree, and the 11-year-old with 5 grade A's at A-level?
Amazing.
The people's verdict is expected. On the text, please, 61054. First word is Simon. Anyway, today's confession came from James, but not really James, who was a journalist whose copy that he was writing for CFAX back in the day, even though he's working for a BBC local station, was picked up by 5 different commercial stations. And so he started dropping in stories of a 7'5" burglar, a 19-stone dog, and a 400-metre tree which had fallen over to block a road. And it was just picked up, and they just used his copy. Anyway, it was a fine tale, and the people's verdict is in. Here it comes.
So Beth in Banstead says, I forgive James. Nothing worse than someone else copying your own work. Pure laziness on the other stations. Barry says, forgiven. When I did hospital radio, we used CFAX for news updates, but as far as I remember, we usually gave CFAX the credit, which meant if they got it wrong, we could always blame the BBC. And Tim from Sutton says, of course he's forgiven. Forget the 400-metre tree. What idiot would believe there'd be a 19-stone dog and put it on the news? Imagine a 19-stone dog. That's not a dog, it's a horse.
Yeah, lots of great stories, lots of fun James had, not called James, obviously. So your confessions, maybe about copying someone else's work, or journalism, or BBC management. If you've got something to confess, we can keep it as anonymous as you like. Just send it to confessions@greatesthitsradio.co.uk. Meantime, Sister Jackie Brambles has some important work to do, along with Brother from Another Gutter, as we judge Tuesday's confession, which comes from Chaz. Thanks, Chaz. Father Simon and the Drive Time Collective. I seek forgiveness for an episode that occurred in the mid-90s at a university on the M4 corridor, somewhere between Slough and Swindon. Narrows it down, not much. At that time, I was studying for a PhD in zoology. I'd recently finished my undergraduate degree at the same university. The undergrad zoology bunch were a geeky lot, and many had exotic pets to keep them company in their various digs and halls of residence. You can imagine how cleaning ladies, and in those days they were all ladies, reacted when confronted with a variety of lizards, snakes, amphibians, and invertebrates. As a mature student with my own flat, I was often called upon to rehome various waifs and strays that were no longer welcome in their previous homes. Strangely, when my fellow graduates departed for pastures new, I found myself still in possession of some of their more unusual pets. One such orphan was Alice, the chili rose tarantula, who, for various reasons, I'd housed in a temperature-controlled room at the top of the Animal and Microbial Science Tower. This was directly above the lab next door to mine, and this was the abode of Dr. Stripes, my flatmate. Tanya was an extremely sweet-natured and somewhat gullible researcher, and Paula, who was a bit of a card and often played numerous japes on her colleagues. She was, unusually for a biologist, somewhat arachnophobic. I'd never really considered playing any pranks on Paula, as she was really quite astute and I have absolutely no poker face. But one Easter, I'd only been in the lab briefly to look after my hoverfly larvae, as you do, and I hadn't seen anyone until the Tuesday morning after the bank holiday. The first person I bumped into was Tanya, gullible Tanya, who, kind-hearted soul that she was, immediately inquired after my long weekend. For reasons that I'm still not clear about, I said, "Fine, except that Alice the tarantula escaped." Alice had actually moved back home to be with the rest of the menagerie. so she wasn't escaped at all. Tanya immediately ran to tell arachnophobic Paula the bad news, and because she believed it wholeheartedly, Paula was immediately taken in, especially when I showed her Alice's previously occupied vivarium, which was now empty. That night in the pub, Dr. Stripes and I discussed at length what we might capitalise on with Alice's newfound freedom. Being the zoology geek that I was and still am, I'd saved all of Alice's cast-off skins.
Oh, right. Of course you have.
As a record of how my girl was growing up so fast. A bit like marking your child's height on a wall or door frame.
Not much like that,
Is
really.
It was a simple matter of leaving these skins in dark corners awaiting discovery. After a few months, my fellow scientists came to realise there was nothing to be afraid of, as these static, in quotes, spiders were not Alice, but merely evidence of her growth rate. Paula had begun to take on a rather haunted look and inquired, "What do all these cast skins mean?" I replied, "Well, she's found a food source and she's clearly getting huge." We all bumped along quite happily for a few months. Alice continued to grow, and there was an occasional sighting. During this period, a team of painters and decorators turned up to freshen up the 7th floor. I got chatting to one chap who was extremely amiable and seemed like he might be up for a bit of a laugh. I briefed him on the ongoing situation and asked if he wouldn't mind spotting Alice, and he agreed. An hour or so later, from behind a very large freezer, a long tirade of cursing and expletives rang out. We all rushed out of our various labs to be confronted by a very irate painter. I quote, "You white-coated types need locking up. Who in their right mind lets blooming great spiders roam around the place? It was the size of a dinner plate. I don't get paid enough for this." It was a performance Sir Larry would have been proud of. If I hadn't known that Alice was safely contained, I might have believed him. Paula had gone a strange colour, but then we were just outside her office. And so we went on. Dr. Stripes and I had a few strategy meetings in the pub, and I'm sure Alice would have eventually grown to be the size of a cat. But then something catastrophic happened. Down on the ground floor was a technician's room full of wondrous pieces of kit where all our glassware got washed. In the pursuit of scientific breakthroughs, we used a lot of glassware, and it was therefore something of a shock when the glassware technicians announced they'd heard about the large spider on the loose and they refused to come anywhere near the 7th floor. Well, there was only one thing for it. We staged the capture of Alice. Various people were auditioned, and it turned out that Val from down the corridor had the best scream. She discovered Alice happily munching on a cricket just outside the lifts, and I bravely captured her. Alice, who was actually large saucer-sized by now, took the whole thing in her stride and calmly carried on with lunch. A somewhat relieved Paula went off to phone her mum and explained that the nightmare was over. Most importantly, the glassware started to get clean again. Father Simon, I don't beg forgiveness from Paula. She'd have had it done to me. She once moved an entire office into a lift so that it greeted its occupant on the ground floor. I do have a beg forgiveness from Tanya, who was innocently duped. The lovely glassware technicians, who really did make life so much easier, whom I suspect thought we were all a bit odd. And finally, Alice herself, who really was a very delightful and well-behaved spider and didn't deserve the reputation she acquired. Because she never really escaped, even though she was my favourite tarantula. Words that have never been used in a confession before. We might get some other tarantula confessions, I don't know. Sister Jackie, what do you say with a voice of responsibility there?
Well, I may have been able to forgive the jolly jape. However, I cannot forgive the collecting of spider skins. It's all a bit Cannibal Lecter-ish for my liking.
Yes, it was the skins that I think might have freaked most people out, brother from another
It is a bit... It is a bit weird, isn't it? That was
Getting
my voice.
emotional now.
Very emotional about the cast-off skins. So yes, I was minded to not forgive. But then I remembered that really aren't all the spiders our friends? Circle of life. That's what I think we're all learning from that. Laughing and learning with the confession tonight. So for that reason, I'm going to forgive.
Laughing and learning.
Laughing and learning. It is my
your
new thing.
buzzword.
Yeah,
Your new
absolutely.
free word.
Yeah, laughing and learning.
Okay, it's a tarantula on the loose, except not confession. The thing is, do you forgive or not? Do you forgive Chaz, yes or no? That is the question. We would like you to send your verdict, please, to 61054. First word is Simon, the People's Verdict, on tonight's tarantula zoology confession. But we did have a confession just before the news. It was the Alice and the Chili Rose Tarantula confession from Chaz. Did people forgive? Here comes the people's verdict right now.
So Alex in Cambridgeshire says, forgiven. If she's dishing out pranks, she's got to be able to take them. And if you cross zoologists expect zoological wrath, I'd have probably brought one of those massive Halloween decoration spiders that are 8 foot wide and stuck it to her office ceiling.
Zoological wrath, is that a thing?
Yeah, seen them live. Gemma in Tooting says, not forgiven. I agree with Sister Jackie. Most bizarre part of this whole confession is the keeping of tarantula skins. Ew, ew, ew. And finally, Tim from Sutton says, not forgiven. I feel like sending her the 19-stone dog from last night's confession.
Which was very good. So if you're a zoologist and you have a confession or a lab story or a spider story or any confession at all, send it to confessions@greatesthitsradio.co.uk. Today's confession, Sister Jackie now dons the habit, as does Matthew, and it comes from Nigel. Simon and team, this story has weighed very heavily on my conscience for 36 years. I've toyed with telling this tale at dinner parties to past wives, friends and work colleagues, but never had the courage. It's 36 years old, but the anxiety of simply rewriting it brings me out in hives. And I promise no one knows the truth of what happened that day until now.
Oh, I like this.
I was 14 years old and at St Custard's, my local posh all-boys boarding school. Life as a boarder was great fun. Breaking the rules, part of the excitement of day-to-day life. It was expected of you. And apocryphal tales of rip-roaring skullduggery from the past generations of boarders were told and retold with great enthusiasm. From blowing up a nearby garage, that story dates from around the Second World War, so that's fine, to intercepting a local pub delivery, the fruits of which kept prefects in warm flat beer for months. The school motto, amongst boarders anyway, was don't get caught. And in my case, I'm pleased to say I never did. Every Monday morning before breakfast and under the steely, watchful eye of matron, all boarders had to take their dirty laundry to the utility area behind the boarding house. It was a hot, noisy and smelly area where food deliveries arrived, bins were emptied and laundry was washed and dried. The Monday morning laundry run was a tiresome routine where we had to put each dirty item with name tags sewn in into the correct black bin. Jeans in one, tops in another, school trousers in another, socks pinned together in another. You get the gist. This would be all washed, dried and pressed, ready for collection on Wednesday. This one Monday morning, the 8:25 breakfast bell had sounded. I was late. By the time I got to the utility area, everyone had gone, including matron. I quickly put my dirty clothes in the correct black bins, careful not to get anything wrong in my haste. As I was finishing off, the local council bin men turned up. I jokingly shouted to them, "Don't forget to empty all of these too," pointing to the bins full of clothes belonging to the 150 boarders. I then rushed off to the canteen. I snuck in, said grace, as we always did, enjoyed a normal soggy toast and tin tomato breakfast, revolting.
Lovely.
About halfway through breakfast, a very stressed-looking member of staff came running in, then matron and a few others dashed for the door. Word got around quickly that the bin men had taken all our laundry. Every one of the black bins had been emptied into the bin lorry and was now headed to landfill. I instantly knew I was to blame. I sat at breakfast, the world spinning around me, knowing it was me who had told them to do it, to take away all the bins with all the clothes. I couldn't believe the bin men actually followed the instructions of a 14-year-old idiot like me and threw away what must have been 15 black sacks of perfectly good, albeit smelly, clothes. It was a nightmare. Not least because I had just chosen my GCSE options and didn't fancy doing them in prison. I sat there thinking hard. Should I confess? Should I say it was me? I did what any normal 14-year-old boy with his future ahead of him would do, and I kept quiet.
Yeah.
Now, you would think that that was where there would be a riot in school, and all our most treasured possessions, our clothes, thrown away. Shocking. But very quickly, things took a different turn. It became obvious that school was going to have to pay to replace everything. And so very quickly, everyone cottoned onto the idea that we could all get new clothes. Now, at the time, Levi 501s were the teenage must-have.
Yeah.
They were expensive and cool, but when other boys, now faced with the chance to upgrade their wardrobe, realizing school were going to have to pay, they claimed that they had put their dirty pair of 501s in the bins that day, ready for washing, before the local bin men had ruthlessly and mistakenly taken them away. The boarding house masters couldn't prove what was in those bins, so had to take the boys' word for it. And we all know where that means. Well, more and more expensive clothes were added to the list, top labels, all expensive, the very latest fashions. And there was nothing the masters could do but to go along with this massive fraud. And whatever the boys claimed to have lost, they went along with rather this than face the angry parents as they had to confess to the mistake. They chose to believe the boys. Well, school coffers were used to pay for the new wardrobes for all the boys, the final bill for which must have run into thousands of pounds. And yet the boarders soon became the best-dressed boys about town. So, Simon and the team, I seek forgiveness for a silly joke that got out of hand. I'm sorry to the masters who had to go on a mass shopping spree with loads of us boys knowing full well that they were being taken for a ride. I only got replacement school uniform as I was so secretly mortified. I'm also sorry to Matron, although she didn't get the blame. I'm sorry for cheating and creating the perfect environment for such a fraud on a mass scale. But I am proud of one thing. I upheld the fine school tradition dating back 400 years and I didn't get caught. Thank you, Simon. Amen, says Nigel, falling at the feet of hard, stern Sister Jackie, who forgives no man and no woman. What do you say?
Well, and I'm staying true to form. Not so much for the lying and the laundry snafu, but more for breaking the cardinal fashion rule that posh boys from St. Custard's can't look cool in 501s.
Do you think that's the thing? I'm
afraid so.
I'm sort of slightly impressed that they all realised that they could upgrade their wardrobe at the school's expense. What do you say, brother from another gutter?
I think you're right. I think it's. Everyone knows this. They're duping the school. The school know they're being duped, but because they can't admit it to the parents, they're having to go along with it and buy everyone top of the range 501s. Fabulous stuff. And actually, wasn't it the system that was at fault here?
Do you think?
I mean, you've been going for 400 years and you're not worked out. Don't put the laundry bins next to the real bins. Dear, are you paying for that education? Dear, oh dear. So for that reason, I'm going to forgive.
A little bit of class war
Bit of
going
class
in there.
war.
Okay, so Jackie's had his say, Matt's had his say. What do you say to Nigel? It's the people's verdict. Do you forgive? Yes or no? The verdict, please, the people's verdict. On the text 61054, first word is Simon. The people's verdict is incoming. Tonight's confession came from Nigel, the tale of 150 boarders at his boarding school, how they lost all of their clothes taken by the bid men on laundry day, and how 150 pupils realised that they could get wardrobe upgrades all paid for by the school because the school didn't know what they'd thrown away. Anyway, a torrid tale of scandalous fraud. The people's verdict is in. Here we go.
And everyone's forgiving. Johnny in Doncaster says, I agree with Matt. Why were the normal bins next to the laundry bins? That's a disaster waiting to happen. Grace in Birmingham, forgiven. Sounds like the boys at St. Custard's were onto something. Upgrading your wardrobe sounds like a fantastic idea. And finally, Albert in Croydon says, all it proves is this staff school were taken to the cleaners. Yes!
Okay, you delivered that like it was the
so
greatest
good.
gag of all time.
It was.
And actually, it was disappointing. Anyway, thank you very much, Steve, for taking part. They were the people's verdict, and another confession coming up tomorrow. If you have one for us, you send it to confessions@greatesthitsradio.co.uk. If you have a confession, don't forget you can send it in to confessions@greatesthitsradio.co.uk. Brother Matthew is with us. He's rattling his mic there.
It is the mic.
And Sister Jackie has joined us as well.
I'm not rattling my mic.
The harsh...
good for you.
The voice of harshness and judgmentalism. That's no such...
Thank you.
We have a confession from Reg, who says, Father Simon and the Holy, hopefully forgiving collective. My confession goes like this. I have been holding on to the guilt pretty much for 30 years. I was a young whippersnapper. I was just 20, working in a garage, and I had newly qualified as an MOT tester, the first rung up the mechanic's ladder. Now, I was finally getting better pay, so I binned the bus pass for my first car, which was a Mark II Ford Escort. A little, shall we say, rough around the edges, but I loved it very much. One day I took my mates to the football. This was a Saturday afternoon, and it was great. Our team won, and all was good. We were on a high, and we all clambered back into my car, and we waited to exit the car park. And then we waited a little bit longer, and then we waited a little bit longer, waited a little bit longer. The cause of the delay, we discovered, was a traffic officer directing out all the visiting teams' cars and coaches before us. So, and this is definitely not a good thing to do, by the way, I wound down the window and I shouted, "Come on, Plod!"
Okay.
Oops.
Yeah.
Let us out. The officer in question, hearing my grumbles, approached the car. You surprised me, not at all, and said, "Is there a problem, Sunshine?" Really realizing that I might have been a little excessive and overly loud, I said, "No, officer, I just wanted to get out and visit my granny and we weren't moving." And let me stop you right there, Sunshine. I'm just doing my job and I'm in charge. All right? Yes, officer. And then he said that terrible sentence, "Would you just pull into that gap over there?"
Oh, no.
Oh, dear.
So we did, and he then went round my car with a fine tooth comb and promptly gave me a long list of faults to correct and to provide proof of correction, all the repairs within 7 days. I was well annoyed. I think you're supposed to go after.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, working in a garage, I could get it done and at trade rate, but it did leave me skint for the rest of the month, and I was rather irate, even though I realise now that being rude to a police officer is a very bad thing. 2 weeks passed, and lo and behold, would you believe it, Father Simon and the Holy Collective, the very same officer pulled up outside my garage. I stayed out of sight. After he left, I zipped into the office and I said, "Oi, Trev," because Trev worked in the office. So I said, "Oi, Trev."
Trev, yeah.
"What's the Astra in for?" "MOT, says Trev. "Aha," I say, "give that one to me." And I had an evil glint of revenge in my eye. Well, to say I was rather strict was an understatement. There were no advisories, only failures. I gave the Nova a damning report, a long list of problems with a big refusal to pass an MOT sheet. A phone call was made and the go-ahead given with a rather large bill on the way. The next day, the Nova was parked outside waiting for collection. I waited excitedly to hand over the keys with a big smile. But then a large Audi turns up. My police officer friend doesn't get out, but he is behind the wheel. Instead, an old lady gets out and walks slowly into the garage. And here I have to do an old lady voice.
Here we go. Yeah.
"I'm here to pick up the..." I was thinking... it's a princess or queen or something.
Yeah, yeah.
"I'm here to pick up the Nova. I'm here to pick up the Nova." "Oh," I say, "is it yours? I thought it belonged to a gentleman." "Oh, no, that's my son. He dropped it off for me. I'm here to collect and pay the bill. I can't believe it needed so much work this time. I don't really use it that much and I don't have a lot of money."
Oh, dear.
To say I felt awful was an understatement. Anyway, the old lady paid and she went on her way. What can only be described as probably the best conditioned Vauxhall Nova now on the road. In my defence, it passed all the following MOTs for the next 7 years with no advisories.
Yeah.
And was then sold on after she gave up driving. A surprising detail that we get at the end. I beg forgiveness from you all. This was 30 years ago and I still work in the trade but have moved garages a few times. But the guilt still stays with me on every MOT. But most humbly and apologetically, I'm still in the same line of work. But I'm always now respectful to all authority figures, and that is what I would advise for all your listeners.
Yes.
Very neat fade.
I thought so.
Very good crossover.
Yes.
Sister Jackie, what do you say to Reg?
Well, I'm afraid, surprisingly, I am not going to forgive Reg, but really more because for being so terribly, terribly un-British and trying to be a queue jumper at the very start of the story. Wait your turn to get out of the car park and then going and exacting your revenge in a very unprofessional manner is a bunch of nonsense.
Okay, so a lack of forgiveness once again from Jackie Bramble's brother from
I'm
another
sorry.
gutter.
So this is where myself and Sister Jackie will differ, because I mean, wasn't it a case of just both of them being a little bit petty? So Mr., let's call him Plod, who was clearly taking it out because he didn't like him calling him Plod, and so he took it out on him by saying he had to get all these things changed on his car, and so he just did a little bit of revenge from him. I think what was most interesting was the car changed from a Vauxhall Astra to a Vauxhall Nova, midway through the confession.
That's the genius of.
Was it the GHR lawyers stepping in to change the brand? Is that what we're doing now? Brilliant. So for that reason, I'm going to forgive.
What? Just because it
changed from an Astra turnover. Yeah.
That happens when a garage is involved. So is the people's verdict, please. Do you forgive Reg, yes or no? A lot will depend on your garage and MOT experience, I suspect. On the people's verdict, 61054. Tonight's confession came from Reg. You know Reg from the garage, who was annoyed by a policeman's traffic control techniques, so he failed the policeman's car's MOT. But it wasn't the policeman. It was the policeman's frail old mother.
Yeah.
And Reg wants forgiveness, but does he get it?
So James in Newport says, forgiven. The copper sounded well annoying. Ultimately, the old lady's car ran like a dream afterwards, so it was a good outcome in the end. Polly in Leeds says, he jumped the queue, he was rude to a copper, then he got his mum to pay loads of money for the car. Not forgiven. But James in Cardiff says, forgiven. He must be one hell of a mechanic to turn an Astra into a Nova.
Okay, it was artistic license, all right? That's the way it went.
Yes.
If you have a confession, we would love to hear it and exchange it possibly for a smart speaker. Send it to confessions@greatesthitsradio.co.uk.